The IMF Trap, Debt, Austerity, and Dependency, How the IMF Crippled Developing Nations. Available alternatives to the IMF and the World Bank. The International Monetary Fund, IMF, has long been a pivotal player in the global financial system, shaping economic policies and providing financial assistance to nations in distress. While its mission of promoting global economic stability and growth is well-intentioned, the IMF's structural adjustment programs, SAPs, have often come under fire for exacerbating economic inequality, impoverishing populations, and undermining national sovereignty in developing nations. This story traces the IMF's role in shaping the economic futures of nations that turn to it during crises, with a focus on how its stringent policies affected countries like Egypt, Morocco, Cameroon, Nigeria, Venezuela, and Argentina. Additionally, we'll explore nations like Botswana, Malaysia, China, and South Korea that charted alternative paths and avoided the pitfalls of IMF dependency. Finally, we shall explore alternative financial systems and how they can shape recipient nations' economic policies and provide financial assistance to these nations in distress. The IMF was established in the aftermath of World War II during the Bretton Woods Conference in 1944. Its primary goals were to stabilize exchange rates, facilitate international trade, and provide financial assistance to member states facing economic crises. However, the 1980s debt crisis marked a turning point for the IMF, giving rise to structural adjustment programs, SAPs, a set of conditions imposed on countries in exchange for loans. SAPs were based on a neoliberal economic framework championed by institutions like the IMF and World Bank. These programs emphasized currency devaluation, to make exports cheaper and more competitive; trade liberalization, reducing tariffs and opening markets to foreign competition; privatization, selling state-owned enterprises to reduce government expenditures and boost efficiency; austerity measures, cutting public spending, including subsidies on essential goods and services like food, fuel, education, and healthcare. While SAPs were designed to stabilize economies and restore growth, they often had the opposite effect. Firstly, the social costs. Austerity measures reduced access to essential services, disproportionately affecting the poor. Secondly, it gives rise to economic dependency. Liberalization policies favored multinational corporations, leading to a drain of wealth from developing nations. Thirdly, the nation develops long-term vulnerabilities. Devaluation and export dependence made economies more susceptible to global market fluctuations. Most of the countries that sought assistance from the IMF faced similar outcomes, as the assistance provided was a one-size-fits-all program. Such as Egypt. Egypt's economic woes in the 1970s were fueled by high military spending, poor economic planning, and a reliance on subsidies to placate a growing population. By the late 1980s, mounting debt and hyperinflation forced Egypt to seek IMF assistance. The IMF prescribed Structural Adjustment Program. The Structural Adjustment Program focused on reducing subsidies, devaluing the Egyptian pound, and privatizing state-owned enterprises. A major component was the removal of food subsidies, particularly on bread, a staple for millions of Egyptians. The policy led to the infamous 1977 bread riots, as food prices surged overnight. Public outrage forced the government to partially reinstate subsidies, but the damage to public trust was irreversible. The long-term effects of this policy was that Egypt's economy became dependent on external debt. Privatization efforts were marred by corruption, with state assets often sold below market value to politically connected elites. Public spending on healthcare and education dwindled, fueling social inequality. Morocco. Morocco's reliance on phosphate exports exposed it to global price fluctuations. By the 1980s, falling phosphate revenues and a burgeoning debt crisis pushed Morocco to the IMF. The IMF prescribed Structural Adjustment Program. The Structural Adjustment Program demanded currency devaluation, public sector downsizing, and reduced public spending on social services. Agricultural reforms aimed to boost exports but neglected food security. The devaluation made imports more expensive, increasing the cost of living for ordinary Moroccans. Public sector layoffs led to unemployment, and cuts to education and healthcare disproportionately affected rural areas. While Morocco's exports improved, domestic industries struggled to compete with cheaper imports. Social inequality widened, particularly between urban and rural areas. Cameroon. Cameroon's economy was heavily reliant on oil and agriculture. By the late 1980s, declining oil prices and corruption-induced inefficiency led to a fiscal crisis. The IMF prescribed Structural Adjustment Program. The Structural Adjustment Program, SAP, imposed currency devaluation, public sector wage cuts, and privatization of state-owned enterprises. The devaluation led to a sharp increase in import costs, while reduced public sector wages caused widespread hardship. Privatization efforts often transferred wealth to elites, exacerbating inequality. Today, Cameroon remains overly dependent on primary commodity exports, with inadequate investment in infrastructure and social development. Nigeria's economic crisis in the 1980s stemmed from a decline in oil prices, excessive borrowing, and mismanagement. The IMF prescribed Structural Adjustment Program. The Structural Adjustment Program included currency devaluation, removal of subsidies, and trade liberalization. The policies devastated Nigeria's industrial sector, which relied on imported raw materials. Subsidy removal led to public protests, as basic commodities became unaffordable. Nigeria continues to grapple with underdevelopment, poor infrastructure, and dependence on oil exports. SAP-era reforms entrenched corruption. Venezuela. In the late 1980s, Venezuela faced mounting debt, inflation, and declining oil revenues. The IMF prescribed Structural Adjustment Program. In 1989, the IMF prescribed austerity measures, including subsidy cuts, currency devaluation, and trade liberalization. The effects were catastrophic, such as the infamous 1989 Caracazzo riots, which epitomized the societal toll of structural adjustment as fuel and food prices soared overnight. Lives were lost, and trust in government collapsed. The IMF's austerity measures intensified inequality, setting the stage for political instability and economic collapse. Venezuela's oil-dependent economy never diversified, leaving the nation vulnerable to global oil price swings. The social unrest fueled by austerity measures paved the way for political instability and the rise of Hugo Chavez. Argentina, the IMF's repeat client. Argentina has been an IMF's repeat client. In the late 1990s, Argentina faced high inflation and fiscal deficits. The IMF prescribed Structural Adjustment Program. Currency pegged to the dollar, privatization, and austerity. A recession ensued, leading to mass unemployment and social unrest. Argentina's repeated IMF interventions have led to cycles of debt, inflation, and political instability. A few countries that experienced financial distress rejected the IMF Structural Adjustment Program and sought alternative paths to recovery. Botswana. Unlike many African nations, Botswana avoided IMF dependency. Prudent management of diamond revenues and building of a robust fiscal reserve allowed Botswana to invest in education and healthcare without IMF loans. Botswana achieved one of Africa's highest GDP growth rates. Malaysia. During the 1997 Asian financial crisis, Malaysia rejected IMF aid and imposed capital controls. This decision allowed Malaysia to recover quickly without the severe social disruptions experienced by neighboring nations. China. By maintaining state control over key industries, China avoided IMF prescriptions and achieved unprecedented economic growth. South Korea. During its financial crisis, South Korea relied on national reforms and public cooperation to stabilize its economy. Conclusion: a world beyond Bretton Woods and emerging alternatives. The legacy of the IMF and World Bank, while marked by some successes, remains controversial for its role in shaping the economic landscapes of developing nations. Structural adjustment programs, SAPs, have been criticized for prioritizing fiscal austerity and market liberalization at the expense of social stability, leaving many nations in cycles of dependency and economic stagnation. However, in recent years, a new wave of alternatives to the IMF and World Bank has emerged, offering different models of financial assistance and development. These alternatives are reshaping the global financial order and providing countries with pathways less encumbered by stringent neoliberal conditions. First is the use of regional development banks, a collaborative approach. Regional development banks such as the Asian Development Bank, ADB, African Development Bank, AFDB, and the Inter-American Development Bank, IDB, have grown significantly in influence. These institutions focus on localized development goals, prioritizing infrastructure, education, and social projects tailored to the specific needs of their regions. Key features of regional development banks include Localized expertise. Regional banks understand cultural, political, and economic nuances, enabling them to craft more targeted solutions. Fewer austerity measures. Unlike the IMF, these banks often impose fewer restrictions on fiscal policies, allowing governments to maintain social safety nets. Collaborative decision-making. Regional development banks give member nations a more equitable say in decision-making, reducing perceptions of external dominance. Comparison with IMF and the World Bank. While regional development banks may lack the financial clout of the IMF or World Bank, their localized focus ensures that assistance programs are more adaptable and culturally sensitive. Nations like Indonesia and Botswana have benefited from regional funding to support long-term development projects without the harsh austerity measures tied to Bretton Woods institutions. Secondly, the BRICS Development Bank, which is a Southern Hemisphere ally, the new development bank, NDB, established by the BRICS nations, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, is a rising force in global finance. Created in 2014 as an alternative to the IMF and World Bank, the NDB offers developing nations loans for infrastructure and sustainable development projects. Key features of the BRICS Development Bank include a focus on infrastructure. The NDB prioritizes infrastructure projects such as transportation, renewable energy, and urban development. Non-dominance of Western powers. Unlike the IMF, where voting power is heavily skewed towards the United States and Europe, the NDB follows a principle of equal voting rights among its founding members. Fewer political strings attached. The NDB emphasizes mutual respect for sovereignty, making it appealing to nations wary of IMF-style conditionalities. Examples of success. South Africa. The NDB has funded renewable energy projects to help South Africa transition from coal dependency to sustainable energy sources. India. Investments in green infrastructure and urban development have bolstered India's efforts to modernize while maintaining environmental sustainability. Comparison with the IMF and the World Bank. The NDB's emphasis on equality and mutual benefit contrasts sharply with the hierarchical structure of Bretton Woods institutions. However, it remains in its early stages and has yet to match the financial scale and reach of the IMF or World Bank. Thirdly, the Belt and Road Initiative, BRI, China's global infrastructure plan. China's Belt and Road Initiative has emerged as a transformative global project, offering funding for infrastructure development across Asia, Africa, and Latin America. Although not a formal alternative to the IMF, the BRI provides countries with significant financial resources outside the traditional Bretton Woods framework. Key features of the Belt and Road Initiative include massive scale. With investments surpassing $1 trillion, the BRI aims to connect continents through infrastructure projects like railways, ports, and energy facilities. Flexible financing. While some BRI loans are criticized for creating debt dependencies, they often come with fewer political or fiscal conditions than IMF loans. Development focus. The initiative focuses on building hard infrastructure, which serves as a catalyst for economic growth. Examples of success. Kenya. The Standard Gauge Railway, funded by the BRI, has enhanced regional trade and connectivity. Pakistan. The China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, CPEC, has brought significant investments in energy and infrastructure, though concerns about debt sustainability remain. Comparison with IMF World Bank. While the BRI offers rapid access to funding and large-scale infrastructure development, its lack of transparency and potential to increase debt burdens are areas of concern. Unlike the IMF, the BRI does not enforce austerity measures, but its long-term economic implications for borrower nations are still being debated. Fourthly, sovereign wealth funds, self-reliant development. Countries with significant natural resource wealth, such as Norway, the UAE, and Botswana, have successfully utilized sovereign wealth funds, SWFs, to finance their development without turning to external lenders. By investing resource revenues in diversified portfolios, these nations create financial buffers for future generations. Key features of sovereign wealth funds include stability during crises. Sovereign wealth funds act as reserves that governments can tap into during economic downturns. No external debt. By relying on their funds, countries avoid the debt cycles associated with IMF loans. Long-term planning. Investments focus on sustainable development and diversification of economies. Example of success. Botswana. The country's Pula Fund has allowed it to invest in education, healthcare, and infrastructure without external loans. Norway. The Government Pension Fund Global, one of the world's largest sovereign wealth funds, ensures economic stability and long-term prosperity. Comparison with IMF World Bank. While sovereign wealth funds provide a self-reliant model, they require significant initial resource wealth, making them unsuitable for resource-poor nations. However, for countries like Botswana, they represent an effective alternative to IMF dependency. Fifthly, cryptocurrency and decentralized finance, DeFi. Emerging technologies like blockchain and cryptocurrency are beginning to reshape global financial systems, offering an alternative to traditional lending institutions. Countries like El Salvador, which adopted Bitcoin as legal tender, are experimenting with decentralized financial models. Key features of cryptocurrency and decentralized finance. Reduced reliance on traditional banks. Cryptocurrencies provide access to financial resources without the need for IMF loans or international banking systems. Potential for financial inclusion. DeFi platforms enable unbanked populations to participate in the global economy. Volatility risks. Cryptocurrencies remain highly volatile, posing risks to nations relying heavily on them. Comparison with IMF World Bank. While decentralized finance is still in its infancy, it represents a paradigm shift that could one day challenge the dominance of Bretton Woods institutions. Lessons learned. The future of global financial assistance. The contrast between nations subjected to IMF austerity and those pursuing alternative strategies reveals critical insights. Flexibility matters. Successful models recognize the unique challenges and potentials of each country rather than applying one-size-fits-all policies. Social stability is key. Alternatives that prioritize infrastructure, education, and social services demonstrate better long-term outcomes than austerity-driven programs. Global equity. Institutions like the NDB and regional banks challenge the dominance of Western-led financial systems, offering more equitable partnerships. As the world shifts towards multipolarity, developing nations now have access to diverse financial tools that enable them to chart their own destinies. While the IMF and World Bank will remain central to global finance, the rise of alternatives heralds a new era of choice and empowerment for the Global South. If you enjoyed this enriching and insightful analysis of global issues, we'd love to hear your thoughts and opinions. Share them in the comments section. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit the like button to receive notifications whenever we upload new, captivating content.